9 years, and I really liked. It's a very different book for me, and it was really fun to do and meaningful to do. I put the slideshow on and play the Ken Burns Civil War music, and I get very nostalgic about writing the book. So the 6th Wisconsin, and if you've been to the Veteran Museum, you recognize Rufus Dawes and the 6th coming through the cornfield at Antietam. I've been told it's still there, and that's Dawes on the left. And these are other commanders of the 6th Wisconsin. I kind of want to give a little bit of an overview of what the book is before I get into the Antietam. I won't spend very much time on it. It has kind of it's an academic book, but I think it has some interest beyond academia. The long Civil War isn't really a jargony term. It kind of sounds that way. It really is, from my use of it, is a common sense approach to the war didn't end for most veterans in 1865. And so other work I've done on veterans really focused on that. But whether it's politics or just memory, reunions and so forth, or health issues or things like this, the Civil War kept going. And so that's a very important part of this. And I thought of this as being a biography of a regiment, partly because I cover it from its origins in April of 1861 to the last guy who dies, I believe, in 1939. I think that's the last veteran who dies at the Soldiers' Home in Milwaukee in 1939. And so that's a lifetime. That's almost 80 years, 90 years nearly, whatever. It's not a math book. And so, but I also show within the war itself that the 6th Wisconsin changes almost completely. It's a very different set of people. And I got at this by looking at, I have a spreadsheet. It's a huge spreadsheet. About 2,000 guys served in the 6th Wisconsin over the course of the war. And of course, the regiment's about 1,000. And so there's a lot of turnover. By the time they fight their first battle, they're down to about 700. There's illness and various other kinds of conditions and discharges. And then they kind of hit 200 and stay there for a long time. Wounded people come and go, sick guys come and go. But by fall of 1864, they're down to 70 guys in the ranks. But 475 draftees come into the 6th Wisconsin in the fall and early spring of 1864 and 5. That's 1% of all the draftees in the Union Army came to the 6th. I don't know why. I have no idea. No one really comments on this. There's no policy made about this. But it becomes a regiment of draftees. And I was able in the research to create this spreadsheet to discover that about 30 to 40 guys served all 4 years. We kind of think of regiments, being constant. We know there's casualties, and just over 50% of all the men in the 6th Wisconsin were either killed, wounded, or discharged for illness during the course of the war. But again, it's a complete turnover. The officers turn over. They have, again, it's an incredible feat. And so that last spring of the war, winter and early spring of the war, is being fought by draftees in terms of the 6th Wisconsin. And they're at Appomattox, they're in the Grand Review, and so forth. And so the biography part is not only the long 80-year history of the men and the aftermath, but it's also showing the regiment as kind of an organic being in a way. It changes a lot. Leadership changes, their experiences change, the kinds of war they fight change during the course of the war. And so that's kind of an overview of what I was trying to accomplish. As I said, Rufus Dawes is the famous commander. If you know of a commander of the 6th Wisconsin, that's probably the guy you know. He led them for most of Antietam, for all of Gettysburg, even though he's only second in command, and then he was the commander during the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and battles then. He left the Army in August of '64. But he wrote one of the best memoirs of service with the 6th Wisconsin, which has been published in many different forms over the course of the century and a half since then. He was preceded by the older guy in the middle, Lysander Cutler. He was the original colonel of the 6th, and he serves up until Gainesville, or Bronner's Farm, the newfangled name for Gainesville, in August of 1862. Is wounded there and never really commands the regiment again. He ends up becoming a brigade and divisional commander. In fact, he commands a different brigade at Gettysburg and fights kind of alongside the Iron Brigade on that first day. And he finishes the war, dies within a year after the war, mainly from his wounds and other complications. He was replaced by Edward Bragg, who's a lawyer from Fond du Lac. He's on the far left. He'd kind of a democratic activist. He was a pistol, very good commander. I think the 6th had extraordinarily good leaders, both the commanders, but also captains. Really good set of captains commanding companies. And Bragg took over from Cutler really from Gainesville on, but again, he missed part of Antietam because he was, as it turned out, now badly wounded. He missed Gettysburg because he got kicked by a horse and wasn't at that battle. But he ended up commanding the Iron Brigade and other units throughout the war and was a congressman after the war, as was Rufus King, in fact. And the guy on the right here is John Kellogg. He was really the last commander of the 6th, and there wasn't really an Iron Brigade anymore by the spring of '65. They still called it that, but there was only a couple of original regiments left. But he'd been captured in this early summer of '64, eventually escaped, made it back to Wisconsin on leave, and then came back to the regiment just before Christmas of '64 and led the regiment for the rest of the war. And he was affected for the rest of his life. He got hit in the head of the wilderness and knocked out and then captured. And he never really got over that. And so those are the guys that lead the regiment through the course of the war. The book certainly has battle narratives. I cover the campaigns and the battles as I should. The core of it, though, is this long Civil War and the databases. But today we're talking about Antietam. And so the 6th Wisconsin came together, as you might suspect, from this low number during the first summer of the war. It was kind of the last regiment put together by the governor at the time. They didn't really have permission to do it. He did it anyway. And they were in Camp Randall. They were finally called to Camp Randall in late June. The last company to show up is Rufus Dawes' company from Marten in Juneau County, and they kind of stumbled into camp. They didn't really know how to do anything. And they were, with the 5th Wisconsin, sent east after First Bull Run, kind of hurried the mobilization process. And so they arrived in Washington, or Baltimore really, and stayed there a few days in mid to late August. And they spent about a year in and around Washington and Northern Virginia before they get into a battle. They were actually on the way to get on board boats to take them to the Peninsula Campaign earlier that summer, and they were called back when Lincoln and others decided there weren't enough troops defending Washington during that major campaign. And so they kind of march around Virginia for a month. Stonewall Jackson is invading Virginia at that point, and they can't find him. So I don't go into all that. I don't want to go into all that detail as such. But one of the interesting things about their experiences, even before they get into a battle, they have a particularly brutal march in the first week in August. They cover maybe 45 to 50 miles in about 2 days, and it's about 98 degrees, and this is August in Northern Virginia. And these are Wisconsinites, and they're not used to the weather yet. And they build a bridge, they burn a bridge, they capture some railroad supplies and whatnot. They don't find any Confederates, and they barely get back to camp. And I just mention this because part of the long Civil War, as I mentioned, is the health of these guys long afterwards. That week in August, probably led 30 to 40 guys to leave the Army with discharges. They had sunstroke or whatever. And in their pension applications years later, on August 5th, we had this march. It's like the first big event in the regiment's life in many ways. And again, people never recovered from it. They blame that week for the rest of their lives. Just coincidentally, this is unrelated to Antietam, a lot of the draftees who applied for pensions at the same time talk about a week in February where they were out living rough in the cold and they didn't have enough coats and so forth. That's their hard week. And dozens of them refer to that in their pension applications. So it's very specific dates that you have to come up with when you do a pension application, but it's an interesting element of this long Civil War. So they gather in they gather in Camp Randall. They head to Virginia. They come under the command of John Gibbon, an old Army. We'll see a picture of him in a minute. Artilleryman, who gives them their particular uniforms: the tall black hats, the frock coats, the white leggings. They look like spats to me, but they're not really spats. Gaiters, right? White gloves. They hate these uniforms, certainly the gaiters and the white gloves. They don't like Gibbon very much, but they're already pretty well trained, but he really gets them into shape and ready for battle during that spring and summer of '62. Finally, they, after kind of another fruitless march looking for Stonewall Jackson, this is just after the Battle of Cedar Creek, which is one of those valley battles. In summer '62. They were just marching along a dusty road between Grovetown and Gainesville near a guy named, a farm rented by a guy named Bronner, when the brigade, not yet called the Iron Brigade, the 6th, 7th, and 2nd Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana, are kind of stretched out along the road, and they are basically ambushed by Stonewall. Well, Stonewall Jackson has much more than a brigade. It's his old brigade, and really about a division of Confederate troops are available. They don't all get into the fight. And that's at the Battle of Gainesville. And this is a great drawing of it by Edwin Waud, W-A-U-D, who is a pretty famous Civil War artist. And this is the 6th Wisconsin going into action. And it's labeled there. You can't really read it. Maybe you can. But Gainesville it happens as dusk was falling. The 6th Wisconsin and the other regiments, 6th Wisconsin last. This is actually them stepping in, as I said, with Battery B, Gibbon's old battery, which is attached to the brigade, going into action. And they pretty much one of those battles where they stand there about 70 yards apart and shoot each other for an hour and a half. And it gets dark. Some of Stonewall Jackson's commanders are wounded. Ewell, who will be kind of famous at Gettysburg, loses his leg at this battle. And so there's some disorder among Confederates. And so the brigade holds its own. They take pretty heavy casualties. 6th Wisconsin comes off relatively lightly, 20 killed, maybe 40 wounded, which is nothing compared to things that come later on. And then darkness falls, and they retreat back through a small wood that gives them some cover, and move back toward the main army. Now, I mentioned Gainesville because it's their first battle, but I think as we move toward Antietam, as the 6th Wisconsin moves toward Antietam, which we know will happen in less than a month after Gainesville, August 28th, they don't know this. And in many ways, what the 6th Wisconsin will think of is two pairs of battles, really, are collapsed. And they always remember Gainesville as the first battle. Usually if you hear about Gainesville these days, it's just the prelude to Second Manassas, Second Bull Run, which is fought a couple of days later. 6th Wisconsin doesn't have a huge role at Second Manassas. There's a couple of things that happen, but they're relatively not untouched. They aren't devastated by it. They actually the brigade provides the rear guard as after that kind of disastrous battle. The Army of the Potomac, or not the Potomac, the Army of Pope's Army of Virginia retreats away from the Confederates. So they do okay there. The other pair, of course, of battles will be South Mountain, a precursor, again, to Antietam. And so here's Gibbon. There's John Gibbon. South Mountain is the battle fought over, well, several passes, mountain passes, that the Confederates were holding, trying to screen Lee's army moving, into Maryland from Virginia. So the army can congregate, consolidate, and have a force ready to meet the Union Army. You get a very little sense of this if you see Hooker right there. Look straight to the left. That's Gibbon. That's the brigade, and they move up against Turner's Gap, and it's a very dramatic thing. They're going across the old National Road, which becomes Highway 30, later on, much later on. The National Road, which is still there, it's at the battlefield, marked very well. But they're kind of astraddle it, and they're just moving up. It's rocky, as some fields, kind of broken by woods, quite a few fences. It's a hard battlefield to manage. Ultimately, they do pretty well. They get up to the top. They don't drive the Confederates away, but they hold their ground. Bragg is commanding there on the 6th Wisconsin side. They're on kind of the right side of the line. He comes up with this, he commands kind of one wing, which folds back on the other wing, and Dawes has the other, and they kind of alternate going up the mountain. They'll fire, and Bragg will say, "Major, I'm coming through, coming over you," and then they go over and stop. And so it's very imaginative. This is not something that is done all that much, I don't think, at this stage of the Civil War, certainly. And they do fine. They get up there. They're almost out of ammunition. Bragg tells them to fix bayonets. I don't know if anybody does that, but this is the story. And when they wake up the next morning, the Confederates have gone. They've retreated. And so they march over on the National Road. General Sumner, one of the Corps commanders, salutes them as they go by because they've done so well. And they spend the march then that day moving over toward where they believe Lee will be, through Keedysville, which is still a town there. It's a little suburban sort of town. People welcome them. They give them water and all this business, and they're very excited about that. About this time, Dawes will write his mother, "My health is good, and I am ready to take my chances." He did not feel that our task is easy or sure of successful accomplishment. The battle will be desperate and bloody and upon very equal terms, as of course it will be. So they enjoyed a little bit the reception they got at the small towns. These small towns will be the locations of hospitals and grave sites within a few days after the battle. They kind of curl up around the Army of the Potomac as this gathering at Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. They take the upper bridge over Antietam Creek, and they go these little narrow country lanes. I was just there a couple of years ago, and they're still very narrow, and the corn was really high, and it was been very claustrophobic and really hot, even in September, as they march over there. They finally get to their place, which is right along the Hagerstown Pike, which is the main road running down kind of the middle of the battlefield, at least the northwestern part of the battlefield. And they're still in formation. They just sort of lie down and go to sleep in formation. They slept on their arms, as they say. Dawes recalled the uneasy night that followed. They had reached their position about dusk. It was drizzly rain. There's intermittent firing in the distance as the armies kind of start feeling each other out, and the artillery checks out what's going on. And again, they laid along the turnpike with loaded guns, not quite knowing what was going to happen. In a diary entry that Dawes probably wrote after the battle, he wrote, "Poets and fools may talk of men's eagerness for battle, but thank God, humanity is not so bloodthirsty and utterly reckless. Nothing can be more solemn than that period of waiting for your summons, the conflict you know to be impending. such was this night. Now Dawes's memoir is great because he actually uses letters he wrote. He edits his letters, and he says, I was wrong about this, or I was right about that, or whatever. He fine-tuned his version of the pre-battle jitters in his memoir. With the certain prospect of deadly conflict on the morrow, the night was dismal. Nothing can be more solemn than a period of silent waiting for the summons to battle known to be impending. So this is the farm near present day location, more or less, of where they were camped. Give you an overview, kind of. If you see the orange arrow at the top center of this map, that's where Gibbon's brigade is. They are not yet called widely the Iron Brigade. South Mountain is where the Iron Brigade gets its nickname. George McClellan, who was their commander at that point, he's back in command after being gone for a while, supposedly had something to do with it. And either he saw and said, who is that brigade marching so well, or whatever, what's the Iron, they're just like iron, or else Gibbon happened upon headquarters, what do you think my brigade now, General? And then he said something like that. McClellan seemed to have something to do with it. He thought so, the Iron Brigade thought so. And just after Antietam, as far as I can tell, you see the first notice of them be called the Iron Brigade. Before that, they were the Western Brigade. They were the only brigade made up entirely of Western, Northwestern really, troops. They're sometimes called the Black Hat Brigade by that time. They make a lot of that. But so they are, you can see them in column there, the 4 regiments in column. And that's where they start the day. And they start the day very early. They wake up, as if you've read any memoirs, you know, they make coffee all the time. They are obsessed with coffee. And so they're making coffee. It's damp. They're damp, obviously. They didn't sleep all that great. They're drowsy. And then generals start showing up. Their divisional commander is Admiral Doubleday of Fort Sumter and mythical baseball fame. Their corps commander is Joseph Hooker, who will become commander of the Army next summer. And they both show up in order of moving up along the pike. And you see, well, the road is, well, just to their left, our left, their right. And so get moving, get going. They hear artillery fire in the distance. And so they move over to try to get a range. Some artillery is kind of confusing, at least to me. And then this happens. This is, I mean, I think the poster for your symposium has this picture, right? I mean, it's just called Antietam. As far as I know, the artist didn't identify the regiment as such. But these guys have black hats, they've got gaiters, it's gotta be the 6th Wisconsin because a shell explodes just over Company A, I think is the company that is hardest hit. 2 men are killed outright, 11 are wounded, and everybody mentions this. This is a pretty dramatic way to start the battle. I think this has collapsed a bit. That's the Dunkard Church. I think that they're not that close yet, you know, when this occurred. This is one of the first things that occurs in the battle to them. Apparently the shell glances off a threshing machine and then explodes over them. One of the wounded is a young man, I think he's 18 or 19, who loses both arms. And I have not been able to find out much about him. He dies in the early 1870s. He went to college for a while. He got married, he had a farm, but he dies, you know, and his pension file didn't exist. That would have been great to see that, to see how he was getting along without parts of, you know, both of his arms. Another, Captain Noyes, loses part of a foot or ankle, and he stays in the Army for quite a while, but he doesn't serve again with the 6th. And he's pretty active after the war. But it's a devastating blow. But Bragg, you know, simply says, you know, the shock was momentary, again, Edward Bragg, the commander at that point, and the column moved on, leaving the mangled bodies of their comrades on the ground. Now, Bragg gets in one of the better comments, I think, of the battle. At one point, a courier rides up and says, raises his cap and presenting the general's compliments passed along Gibbon's order to press the enemy as far as is safe. And Bragg raised his own hat and replied, "Colonel Bragg's compliment to General Gibbon, it has been damned unsafe here for 15 minutes," before ordering the Sixth forward. And so they move on after this kind of blow. And this is Miller's Farm looking north, actually. So they're coming toward us, kind of on either side of the pike here. Some of the company, the Sixth, slid over to the east side of the pike, which is to your right, is east of the pike, looking at this. And they start working their way through Miller's Farm, through the orchards and gardens. Dawes trying to get his left wing up with Bragg's right wing, which is still on your left side, the west side of the pike. Orders skirmishers for John Kellogg, who I showed the picture of the captive who became the last commander, is commanding the skirmishers. And they had dashed across the field at a full run. Now that is not how I imagine skirmishers operating. Whenever the skirmish line goes out, it's a very loose line, usually maybe one company out of a regiment spread along a certain front. And they're meant to feel out the enemy, to drive in the skirmishers of the enemy. It's kind of a vague, I think, operation in some ways. But I don't think they're dashing around. But these guys dashed around. They drove Confederates out of these orchards and the outbuildings near the farmhouse. At this point, the other regiments in the brigade, the 2nd Wisconsin is to their left, your right, also moving south. The 7th and the 19th Indiana are your left to the west of the turnpike, moving toward Confederates. Once the skirmishers are cleared, Dawes, again commanding about half the regiment on the east side of the turnpike, orders the man here on the right, Edwin Brown, to file through a gate. They had to get through a gate, reform on the flank. And as Brown, sword raised, Dawes says, turned to shout the order, he's shot in the mouth and killed. It's one of the more, dramatic moments. If you're interested in Brown, the letters are here, his letters home. He's not a very happy camper most of the time he's in the Army, but he writes really interesting and useful and moving letters home to his wife. He had a couple little kids back in Fond du Lac. He's a lawyer. And so he dies almost immediately. Another story has a shell hitting him and taking off part of his jaw. But as Dawes worked to get the company through the gate and into the line, the air above them is our heads filled with the screaming missiles of the contending batteries. Well, back to the west side of the turnpike. In one of the few real failures of an officer in the 6th Wisconsin, the officer commanding the skirmishers on that side is a man named Hoey, Alexander Hoey from Prairie du Chien, which is one of the centers of recruitment for the 6th Wisconsin. And as Bragg described it later, his commander, Edward Bragg, described it later, Hoey showed the white feather that morning, dodged behind a tree, and grew there, letting his line go helter-skelter without direction and causing the companies following him to drift to the right. Alone among the companies that day, the company C, his company, had virtually no casualties. They just kind of dropped out of the fighting, which left uncovered, as they would say, the other companies when the Louisiana Tigers opened up on them and basically again ambushed them. One of the dramatic moments there was a different captain, a very good, an old German named von Bachel, is killed at that point. They'll find his body later on with like 12 bullets. That's how heavy the fire was against those companies. Hoey actually never goes back to Wisconsin. His dad had been commander at Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien, and his mother, and he had stayed there after the father died. And so he went home, he worked as a laborer and then as a federal employee in Washington. And again, as far as I know, he was never back in Wisconsin. Well, the key point and the most famous part of Antietam for the 6th Wisconsin is, of course, the cornfield, the cornfield. There have been fighting there earlier. They're not the first ones in the cornfield. And Dawes has a breathless, first-person, present tense kind of narrative about what was going on. Now again, once clear of the farm, just to get you caught up, Bragg pushed his regiment, actually the left wing, as a few companies were still west of the Pike, into this large cornfield. There's a couple of cornfields. This is the cornfield just south of the Miller farm. At about that time, he sent for Dawes, and as Dawes ran up to him, he said, "Major, I'm shot." My sense is he got shot in the arm. He thought he'd been shot in the side because there was blood there, and he fell down. And so Dawes is in command of the regiment for the rest of the battle. His narrative becomes a story of, again, present tense with sound and furious action and dramatic views. They push the Confederate forward. It goes very well at first in the cornfield. Beyond the corn, they reference a field of clover, apparently. I think that's what might be there now, too, when you get out of the corn. So this is the southern edge of the cornfield now. And, of course, these guys should be flipped around coming out of the cornfield. But they moved through it. They toured the church. This is the Dunkard Church, or Dunkard Church sometimes it's called. And so, again, I think that's why the painting has collapsed the geography a little bit. And they're doing great. The powder is bad, Dawes says. The guns have become very dirty. And when that happens, it takes, if the barrels get dirty, they get smaller. The holes are smaller, and so it takes longer to punch the bullet down into it. Our firing is becoming slow. A long and steady line of rebel gray comes sweeping down through the woods around the church to the right and in front of the 6th. They raise the yell, the famous rebel yell, and fire. It is like a scythe running through our line. Now the 6th turns to escape the new threat. Dawes grabs the state flag, and as they kind of flee back to the corn, he gets them stopped and rallies them. He says later on, "As fast as I could run from the point where the regiment broke to the point where I reorganized, took about 5 minutes." So they moved back quickly through this corn, which must just be shredded by now. I always thought the farmers in the group, and most of them were farmers, was, wow, that's a pretty good field of corn that we're ruining today. And they charge again. They move through the corn, and then they are repulsed finally and are required to move back. They get mixed up with other regiments by this time, especially from New York, who are fighting to their left in the cornfield. Dawes talks about kind of regrouping and marching back up along the turnpike for a while. If you read enough, and again, was not a military historian before I started doing this. I'd read a lot of military history, but I'm not putting together the movements of units is really complicated. And they're operating completely independently. There's 2 or 3 regiments here, a brigade here, a company there. And I just had this sense of Dawes and the 200 survivors of his regiment just sort of forming up and just marching down with this fighting going on all around them. They arrived just near the Miller farm, where Battery B has taken position and has been under very severe fire. And again, this is Gibbon's old unit. He commanded them until well into the war, in fact, and before the war. And they'd taken a bunch of casualties, and Gibbon got off his horse and went over and started serving a gun and aiming cannon, for these men. His face is black with powder smoke, Dawes said, and he kind of grabs Dawes and his men and says, "You're going to defend these books. The Confederates want these guns, and they shan't have them." And they don't get them eventually. But there's a severe fighting, really heavy fire going on by this time. Ultimately, they withdraw more into woods farther back. They end up about where they started out the day. They withdraw some woods. They're still under heavy fire, so there's branches flying around them and so forth. Have you ever seen Band of Brothers on HBO? There's cannonading they have. It's kind of after the Battle of the Bulge, but they're in a woods. And it's not the cannon fire, it's the splinters that's dangerous, for them. And I get a sense this must be what this would have been like, at least briefly. About this time, they have kind of a moment to pause. They kind of get into some safety. Dawes realizes that of the 280 men who went into the cornfield with him, 150 had been killed or wounded. We're talking about half an hour, 45 minutes, before, like from Miller Farm to the cornfield and back. It can't be more than that, really. At about this time, the survivors of the 2nd Wisconsin, which is probably the hardest fought unit of any Wisconsin regiment, and one of the most hard-hit regiments of any in the Army. The survivors of the 2nd Wisconsin showed up, a captain and 18 men. Now, they weren't all killed, but those are the only that were still in a unit. While this is going on, Kellogg, who I mentioned before, had led the skirmish line, also had been so sick he could barely walk that morning, but he insisted on going into battle, had started to kind of gather stragglers, guys from other regiments that were kind of wandering back or running back, pulled his revolver, kind of grabbed them, forced them, pushed them into kind of a makeshift regiment behind a fence with some safety. And then the 20th New York kind of shows up, the 9th Indiana kind of wanders in, and for a time Dawes commands all of they don't really do anything, but is the officer in charge of this kind of hodgepodge of units from various parts of the cornfield and the woods and west of the turnpike and so forth. Another unit passes by, a bunch of New Yorkers, and there's little altercations with them. They'd been a unit that a few days before at South Mountain had been ordered to go up and relieve the Western Brigade, and the commander had refused. Said, "I'm not taking my men up that hill in the dark. All men are cowards in the dark." And so they stayed in safety. Bragg will talk about this for years. He hates this so much. And so when this brigade passes in front of them, they start, yelling back and forth, and I think there are little fist fights here and there. Oddly enough, and this is kind of how the battle ends for them, Bragg shows up, and he's okay, as it turns out, with a couple of barrels of molasses cookies. I don't know where he got them, don't know why he thought that was the best thing to have right now, but it's the first food they'd had all day, and really for a couple of days. And so they're standing around eating cookies and talking about the battle. There's actually a group of like 30 recruits that have been kind of following them, trying to catch up with them. This is where they catch up, and they miss the battle, but they get some cookies, I guess, but they hear about the battle and what it was like. And so that ends Antietam for them. And this is 9:30 in the morning. I mean, this is not, the battle goes on the rest of the day. I'm going to take a moment here, because this is just kind of interesting. And I noticed, this is Ezra Carman. He was on the Antietam Battlefield Commission late in the 1990s. And a lot of what we know about the 6th Wisconsin's movements is that he had written to Dawes and Bragg and sent like a version of this map. I don't know if you can really read it. You can see the Miller cornfield there, some plowed, some grass, there's the big cornfield down here. And he asked Dawes and Bragg to sort of annotate this map and see where were your units, when was it, where'd you go, and so forth. So they both did this in lots of detail. I just noticed in the bookstore they have Ezra Carman, and he was at the battle too. His book about the Antietam Campaign is in the bookstore just over here. But he creates these maps that are timed. And so I'm not going to repeat all this stuff. Just to give you, this is a curiosity, I think. Because these guys, this is the 1890s, so this is 30 years later, and it's like Bragg and Dawes did it yesterday, the memories they have and the specificity they have. And so the orange arrows show where the 6th Wisconsin is at any given time. And again, it's upside down. I don't know why he did it this way, so it's not going to be real meaningful. It's just sort of an interesting artifact, I think. And so there's daybreak, and so somewhere along this line is when the shell explodes near them, then 6:15, 7 o'clock, 7:20. And so by this time they're swinging back over toward the road. I think the one that at 7:30 they're defending the battery, more or less. So they're, again, on the west side of the pike, and then they start moving. You see that the arrow here on the one, 6th Wisconsin is in one line, moving north there. So that might be what Dawes is talking about when he talks about forming the line and going back up the turnpike. And then that's where they kind of end up. More or less back where they started. So they don't accomplish much except win everlasting glory on that day in many ways. So, what about aftermaths of this battle for this regiment? Given their close contact and the fact that a number of their comrades are assigned about it, early in the war when maybe 30 members of the Iron Brigade are actually detached and put into Battery B, which again is an old army, a regular army artillery unit. Many men in the 6th would have heard with horror, mixed perhaps with some understanding, of the old cannoneer in Battery B who, in great pain, and knowing that he had just hours to live, had drawn his revolver and shot himself in the head after saying, "Those few hours are not worth living." So that's the story. Gibbon writes his wife home because he knew this guy from the old army. So that's one of the first stories they would have heard, I think, about the battle after the fighting stopped. As after all battles, they spend some time burying their comrades, and the practice at the time was to bury them pretty much where they fell, thinking they would go back and be reburied, and they are, of course, eventually. This is part of a map, which you may have seen, there's one of Gettysburg too, of burial sites at Antietam before the big cemetery is created. And so Bragg talks about burying maybe 18 or 19 guys near the church. And so it's got to be some of these. They're in a long row. They dug it actually with a kind of a hoe that a cannoneer would have to help dig in their gun when they find a position. So it's a very shallow grave, and they mark it with names. There's Captain von Bachel, who I mentioned earlier, is buried there as well in a separate grave, along with a dog that he picked up along the way, who was also killed in the fighting. And so they spend time doing that, as all regiments would after a big battle like this. But that's not where everybody was buried. In fact, most of them weren't buried. Of the guys who were wounded and sent to the hospitals in Keysville and Boonesboro and various other places, in April 1863, months later, there's a list of guys who were still in the hospital, but also burial places of guys who were killed or died after Antietam. So there's a graveyard in Keysville where two boyhood friends are buried together. They died almost at the same instant on the battlefield. And so there's a grave with a marble slab to the memory of Franklin Gerlaw and William P. Black with their ages. Brave soldiers rest. There's a couple of other guys buried in the same little graveyard. Abraham Fletcher, Company K, died at Mr. Lance's place in the village. There's no headboard, but the grave will be pointed out by Mr. Lancey if someone wants to know where it's buried. There are 10 to 12 other graves with no slabs or boards, nothing whatever, the newspaper account said, to distinguish them. But Mr. Keady, clearly the guy the town's named after, would furnish marble slabs for $16 each. He wouldn't charge for transportation or for putting them in, but if you ordered a marble slab, he'd put it by the grave tower. And so there's just a list of other small makeshift graveyards where 6th Wisconsin and others are buried. 2 days later, as the Army moves on, the Confederates move back across the Potomac eventually. The Army of the Potomac moves along Sharpsburg and Hagerstown Turnpike, where, as Dawes wrote about, there were frightful piles of dead. Now, these are really famous photographs. I'm sure you've seen them before. They're the ones that will be exhibited in New York in a few weeks, along with many others. These are among the first dead ever photographed certainly on the Civil War battlefield, but on almost any other battlefield as well. Dawes wrote that the site was this site is what he compared every other battlefield to for the rest of the war. the angle of death of Spotsylvania, the Cold Harbor slaughter pen, the Fredericksburg stone wall. My feeling was that the Antietam Turnpike surpassed all in manifest evidence of slaughter. The scene was indescribably horrible. Great numbers of dead, swollen and black under the hot sun. Union and Confederate intermingled, lay upon the field. My horse, as I rode through the narrow lane made by piling the bodies along beside the turnpike fences, trembled in every limb with fright and was wet with perspiration. Interestingly, at Gettysburg, about 9 months later, there'll be 6 Wisconsin dead piled up along a fence along the Chambersburg Turnpike after their first day of fighting. A tragic case of wrong identity roiled 2 families in Fond du Lac immediately after the battle. When Cornelia Bragg, Edwin Bragg's wife, received a telegram that said, pretty abruptly, "Your husband was shot yesterday. I will send him home by express." This is some sergeant, orderly sergeant. Preparations were made for our hero's funeral. He was kind of a big deal lawyer in town. And until another telegram arrived from Chicago, where a party of locals had gone to meet the body. It was, of course, not Bragg, but Edwin Brown who was being sent home, whose decomposing body was in the coffin. The telegram said the body is Captain Brown instead of Bragg. We'll be home tomorrow. The scheduled funeral was held, different guy, the casket was closed. I mean, I'm sure his face was disfigured by the wound, for one thing. And Bragg reflects on this. He actually kind of gets into it. There's a little obituary printed before the error is discovered. He kind of gets into the obituary. He thinks of himself as being a hero a lot of the time, and he's a very good officer. But in a surprisingly modern, if heavy-handed, leveraging of the incident into an effort at long-distance child rearing. He had kids probably 3 to 6 or 7 years old. He wrote, "Now, my little ones, you see how certain you should be to be always a good and kind to your mama and to each other. How bad you would feel should Papa die, thinking that he left some naughty little ones to add to their mama's troubles and sorrow." That's using guilt really well, and if you're a parent, you know how that is. Bragg included sort of a serial comic. He wrote, "Letter from Gibbon," who extended his sympathy for the distress she had suffered. And as these mistakes are of frequent occurrence, the best advice I can give you is that, given my own life, never to believe your husband is dead until he himself writes you it is so. Now, Gibbon was a professional soldier and perhaps able to distance himself, yet it seems that his and Bragg's responses to this particular tragedy might also reveal a deflection, a way of coping with that terrible day of combat that every member of the regiment, of the brigade, the Army, would have to reckon with for the rest of their lives. And these are Bragg's and Brown's graves at Renzi Cemetery in Fond du Lac, just kind of over the hill from one another. And that's what I've got for you today. Thanks. And I've got time for